some and then we'll know. Okay, folks. Okay. Good morning. Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to you, Chief Constable, for your team and all those watching online. Welcome also to Mukesh Sharma and Brendan Mullen as newly appointed independent members joining us today. We have your report, Chief, and my remarks will be brief as we have a lot of questions. Since our last meeting, we've had a vile threat made against the families of officers, and we've returned to a severe threat level, meaning an attack is imminent. No one should have to live under a threat because of a career choice, and neither should their loved ones. Add to that, over the last 10 days, we've seen the terror criminal elements in the community have brought to it. As a board, we spent a very productive time with you and your team last week talking about the future delivery of policing and the real organisational risks faced going forward. And of course, we have just published our policing plan for the year ahead. As we enter a new financial year, we are at a critical juncture. At this time, we are collectively, as a society, reflecting on the peace process, a process that policing has played a central element to. People in positions of influence and leadership now need to realise and properly understand the impact that the failure to invest and properly resource policing will have. This quote taken from a news piece this week summed it up for me. Peace is not just the absence of violence, but the presence of justice. And without proper resourcing of policing, justice will not be visibly present or served. As a board, we are unanimous in securing the resources now needed for the service and supporting you in explaining the demands and pressures faced. So I'll leave it there, Chief Constable. We have a range of questions today, but first we'll take your opening remarks. Over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chair. I probably will indulge in a bit of detail at the start of the meeting because maybe, as often been the case, in the space between submitting the report to you and being here today, a lot has changed operationally. So I think if I give a sort of thumbnail sketch of the situation that we're facing, I think it's suffice to say the overall tone in both the operational threat and the resourcing picture is stark and sombre. But I'll give you some details and obviously we'll get going with the meeting. As you said at the start, Chair, and welcome for those comments, that we're now dealing with a severe terrorist threat, which means an attack is highly likely right across Northern Ireland. I think the thing to stress for members and beyond today is the main focus of these attacks continues to be police officers, both on and off duty, as you say, and their families. It will also include prison officers and military personnel, and the style of attack that we're dealing with and trying to frustrate is gun attack and bomb attacks on these people by a small number of determined dissident terrorists. What this means is that working with our security partners, there's an assessment about an increase in their intent and capability to cause serious harm to us in the next 6 months. This comes at a time, as you know, of unprecedented policing demand for us across Northern Ireland. And reflecting, just as we sit here today, on the sort of normal sort of attrition of events and people. Since we last sat here, another 37 officers have left policing. So not only are we doing with more, as we've said more than once, we're doing it increasingly with less. With all this in mind, and working with the team that we've got here today, after careful assessment, we've decided that in order to maximise the safety of our officers and staff and the wider community, it is necessary to increase our operational capacity immediately, and I'll give you some details in a minute. In policing terms, we've initiated what we call Operation Inspire Level 4. So what that means is that in some cases, operational officers across the service have moved to 12-hour shifts, and officers in a number of non-frontline roles will move to support the collective effort to focus on preventing further terrorist outrage and actually increasing our patrol visibility across the country. Many members will realise that this is the first time in a number of years we've had to activate this plan, and it's a reflection of the quite difficult and exceptional circumstances we find ourselves in. Mark is going to coordinate our operation response. The requirement for this uplift will be kept under continuing review, given some of the other events we're dealing with, which I'll address shortly. The initial period we assess, working at this pace and tempo, will be about 10 days, and then we'll review it after that, and it may or may not continue. The uplift is supported by quite a detailed and coordinated command and control structure, which will encompass a number of keynote events over the next few weeks. If that wasn't enough, as you know, we're on the cusp of the Easter period, which is traditionally quite busy. There's a significant policing operation now in place that's been led by ACC Singleton over the 4-day period. To give you some sense, on top of everything else of scale, there are now 90 notified parades and events taking place between Good Friday the 7th of April and Easter Tuesday the 11th. There's also a full programme of football matches on the evening Friday the 7th. We've got, again, command and control structures in place right across the country, and then these structures will flow into the arrangements for the visit of the President of the United States next week, which ACC Todd is leading for us. In addition to the number of notified parades, our planning is based on experience of the operation in recent years, which also takes into account the risk and likelihood of policing non-notified parades. This may include, just some members are aware, the display of paramilitary uniform and paramilitary shows of strength, and we will have resources and a plan in place to deal with that, including evidence gathering assets. We're also assuming that attempts will be made to draw us into situations which may likely cause disorder over the next few days. We would, of course, encourage everyone planning these events to take part in them in a way that's safe, peaceful, and lawful. In relation to the sort of other widening policing context, and I know there may be some issues later, as you referenced at the start, we've also been dealing with a dispute amongst criminality in the Ards North Down area, which again, between Mark and Bobby, they've been leading on. And obviously the tone and context of this is a feud amongst paramilitary groups. We have put additional resources, as many of you have seen over the last week, into that area, dedicated to prevention, disruption, and investigation. And to date, we've made 13 arrests. There are 8 charges and 1 person reported to the Public Prosecution Service. And we want to place on record our thanks for the cooperation we've enjoyed in the last week from responsible members of the community and also from our partners who are working with us more long term in relation to community safety options. And again, we may come back to that. The other issue, of course, we're dealing with, it's hugely important for us, is Operation Rondoletto. That's the policing operation which wraps around all the Good Friday Agreement events, which start clearly with the visit of the President next week. He'll arrive, I think it's now in the public domain, in Northern Ireland on Tuesday evening, 11th of April, and will leave on the Wednesday the 12th. Engagements are being planned for in a number of parts of the Greater Belfast area, and the Prime Minister is also expected to visit Northern Ireland during this time. So all of this is under the command of ACC Chris Todd. The second phase of the policing operation will be between the 17th and 19th of April, and a number of politicians who were in office at the time of the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, as well as current office holders, will be in attendance at these events. At the same time, between the 18th and 20th of April, there will also be a high-profile Cyber UK conference at the International Conference Centre and other city centre venues, which are attracting significant numbers of people, both from the political space and professional background. And also, we're now seeing increasing political interest in the All-Star ice hockey game on the 19th of April involving a Ukrainian team. The policing operation will be significant, and our role obviously is to facilitate all of these events in a safe way and provide protection to the variety of visitors, politicians, participants, and also to keep the venues that are associated with these events safe. Only yesterday, the Deputy Chief Constable and I actually tested the key operational plans that Chris is putting together to get assurance that we're doing all that we can. Mindful of the threat level we've talked about, a theme that runs throughout these plans is to assure the safety of our officers and staff whilst they're continuing to police the country to keep people safe. We've touched previously on the notion of mutual aid. Simply, we do not have the capacity to resource all of this ourselves, given the completing sort of requests that we're dealing with. I'm obviously really grateful to colleagues from across UK policing that have now provided in the region of 300 officers that will be based here over the next 2 weeks to provide specialist support services to help police some of that operation. And my proposal will be over the next few days to try and see where they're staying myself, to assure myself in terms of the arrangements we've made to make sure that their visit is well resourced and they get appropriate support. So that's a big thank you to them. Some of the examples will be, for example, specialist motorcycle escort officers, firearms specialists and search specialists. You will see people from other parts of the UK here. Clearly, given where we have started today, this will drain the resource that's available for day-to-day policing and also put an additional cost pressure into our already stretched budget. We assess it will be in the region of £7 million to police the events over the next few days in relation to Rondoletto, but that cost may change up or down as we get more clarity. And finally, I think it's worth stressing, Chair, as you hinted at in the start, that if all this was not enough, our budgetary position worsened last night with the announcement of further cuts, where we estimate this will amount to an equivalent of 20% of our opening budget. So this is significant. Pamela and the team are starting to supply information to the Department of Justice, which was asked for last night, but this is unprecedented and amounts, I suppose, to the key tension that we're now managing as a team, sort of an unprecedented rise in threat and work for police service at the time of shrinking resource will have to be realised within the next few months. We aren't going to balance the budget given the scale of the ask at the moment, and we may explain that further during the course of this meeting. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chief Constable. We're going to go across to colleagues for questions. So the first question is from Mike on disturbances in Ards.
Thank you, Chair. Simon, I first of all want to speak in solidarity and in support of Johnson McDole, your District Commander in Ards and North Down, and his entire team, particularly the Neighbourhood police team, because I can only imagine how difficult it is when they're on the ground and then you're having to send in specialist teams, as it were, on top of them. And I think Johnson has done a fantastic job in terms of the balance between upholding the letter of the law and maintaining the peace. And I refer to that mass gang who roamed Ards the other day particularly. I wonder if you agree the solution is not just a policing issue. There's a question, for example, about how come the South East Antrim, UDA, end up in Newtownards. So there has to be a multi-agency approach. And I wonder, first of all, if you think this is an opportunity for a fork in the road, where we say to those who want to transition and use their energy positively for the community, that politically we create a pathway for them. But at the same time, for those who continue to want to line their pockets, intimidate and use coercive control, there has to be a response, which will fall to you. Secondly, I'm wondering about the cost, given the budgetary pressures, the cost of policing over the last number of days. And finally, on a downside, just your thoughts on the wisdom of parking a BMW in a bus lane for collection.
Thanks. Obviously, firstly, appreciate the support there, Mike. I know obviously you'll be heavily invested in that part of the country for all sorts of reasons, and I have recognised myself the work that the team have done, and even in recent days you've seen not just what we're saying, but a lot of feedback from the community about the inroads that have been made by the Neighbourhood team, which probably actually gets back to wider questions as the meeting goes on about long-term plans for neighbourhood policing, given the pressures that we find ourselves on. You make some really good points. I'll bring Bobby in a minute to talk about the specifics, probably to bust some myths in relation to the infamous car incident, because it was one of those issues that perhaps not all it seems on social media. But in the specifics, working backwards, at the moment, the policing operation additional resource, I think, was an initial cost of about 75,000, but again, we're keeping that under review. I think in the strategic sense that there are a number of points that we would sort of want to support you and others on, but clearly, is there enough sort of opportunity to get momentum to say to those that want to behave in a responsible and peaceful way, we should look at the transition question, because what we're really dealing with here is organised criminality that peddle drugs, and we need to call that out. I think in terms of the strategic sense, I would welcome the board's support on the notion that we're only speaking to the Department of Justice about yesterday. We've tried a few times to get what I call the Community Safety Board off the ground. It sort of comes into space around the policing of bonfires, and both, I think in recent years, Mark and Bobby have been involved in that. But I do think you're right, there are bigger strategic questions around, for example, housing, and other policy that we should be using in a more coordinated way, notwithstanding the Tackling Paramilitary Programme to make sure that we're consistent, and there is one agenda here to actually sort of push those people that want to poison their communities out and actually make sure that life is safe and tolerant for everybody in those sort of parts of that you refer to. But I'll let Bobby sort of give a bit more detail on the operational specifics.
Thanks, Chief, and thanks, Mike, for both the question and for singling out the District Commander and in particular the Neighbourhood team and their colleagues who've been doing a fantastic job there, I think, in terms of not only the preventative policing operation, but making sure that our style and tone is appropriate, and I'll return to that in due course. It's now been a week since the last actual attack has taken place. We're absolutely not complacent about that, but I think it's a measure, a demonstration of the success of the policing operation over the last number of days. Since March 22nd, however, a number of homes have been attacked, many of which were occupied at the time. Houses have been attacked with pipe bombs, petrol bombs and other implements. Whilst these attacks have reputedly been focused on members of the rival gangs, at the time of the attacks there have been children in the houses. And in fact, some of the attacks as well have happened at the homes of innocent parties who've been either identified through mistaken identity or the recklessness of those involved. Just to give you a scale of the challenge that the command team and the officers are facing down there, we're now dealing with more than 50 individuals who have been subject to some form of threat. So that creates a massive spread in terms of not only the local geography, but how we apportion our resources to that. The overall aim of our policing operation quite clearly is about protecting life and property, preserving order and preventing the commission of offences. Where offences do take place, of course, then we have a responsibility to make sure that we take measures to bring the offenders to justice. Our officers have also been using a range of different policing powers. These include the Justice and Security Act, which allows us to search without suspicion for munitions, and also Article 23B of the Public Order Northern Ireland Order. And that's powers that we have that can be granted by an inspector in anticipation of potential violence. Now I say that because there is the possibility that when we exercise those powers that, again, innocent members of the public may find their own human rights engaged. We're conscious of that, and it goes back to your initial point about the style and tone of the policing operation, and in particular the community policing emphasis that's been placed upon that. What I can tell you and reassure the wider board is that the engagement that we've had back from the local community has been excellent in terms of their support for the operation and what their experience has been of it. So our operation and indeed our collective support to it will continue for the foreseeable future.
And the BMW, Bobby?
Yes, I'll go into some detail on this, Mike, just to make sure that we get this right, and I know that other board members have asked similar questions today. So look, the police service do routinely take property into our possession, and we do routinely store these items within our police estate. The seizure, handling and management of our property is governed through a service instruction which all officers would be conversant with. In this particular case, the BMW X5 had at a point in time been seized in connection with an investigation following the arrest of 4 men last Friday on the Kempstones Road in Newtownards. The incident was, as has been widely documented, linked to the ongoing feud between the two rival gangs. In the interest of public and officer safety, the vehicle was brought to Dundonald PSNI, and that was in order to facilitate a search by specialist officers, and that also included the use of a specialist search dog. On completion of the search, we had effectively finished with the vehicle, and we made arrangements with the vehicle's owner, who was still in custody, for them to have the vehicle collected, and it was by agreement that it was placed outside Dundonald Police Station in the expectation that it would be lifted in the near future. The vehicle was not lifted on the Friday evening, it was not lifted on the Saturday, and then we had the incident in the early hours of Sunday morning. The vehicle did remain in situ outside the perimeter of Dundonald Station during that time, and our CCTV footage from the station shows that at around 4:45 in the morning, 2 males walked past the police station. They then turned back on themselves and approached the vehicle, momentarily going out of sight. And I've viewed this CCTV myself, and I've seen that it is literally a matter of a couple of seconds. What it appears that they've done is set fire to a fire lighter and set that on the rear driver's side wheel of the vehicle. At 04:50 hours, a passing police patrol observed the smoke coming from the fire lighter. They got out, they extinguished the fire, and were joined shortly after that by Northern Ireland Fire and Rescue Service, who I understand then, as part of their drills around these things, have smashed the windows in the vehicle. So we're talking about a very small fire, a fire lighter placed there in a matter of seconds, and it was effectively extinguished by the first police call sign that attended within 2 to 3 minutes. Security at the site on the night was being provided by G4S, and we're working with them in terms of a review of the incident. That's being led by the district commander. The incident itself is being treated as arson and is being investigated by detectives from our Bangor CID office. And the CCTV imagery that we have will provide us with a very strong line of inquiry in terms of taking the investigation forward.
Okay, thank you. Joanne, please.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thanks, Chief. Thanks, Bobby, for that. My question follows on from Mike's. You'll appreciate that Dundonald's in my constituency, so I'm going to be parochial with my question on this at this time. I think this issue speaks to confidence, because this issue outside the station follows kind of on the heels of the incident in Newtownards, where somebody was able to enter the station and spend some considerable time enjoying themselves in a Land Rover. The threat level's increased, and I think there's an expectation from the public that stations are safe and secure, and that's not how it appears with these two incidents. So I think that there's a level of public reassurance required. That I also think there's potential for this to create the impression of incompetence that's unfair. And I'm glad to give you the opportunity to try and address this, because I think the public need reassurance about what steps have been taken to make sure that this type of thing doesn't happen again, and that stations are not up for grabs when officers and their families are under threat. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, John. Well, again, after the first incident, which we spoke about, I think it was last month, we carried out a wholesale review of station security. It's worth noting that, in fairness, as Bobby said, that the issues are being reviewed, but the job of the security staff at Dundonald are to protect the police station, not the parking bay outside. And I think we've explained this morning that there were 2 attempts which were effectively not responded to for a person representing the owner to come and collect the vehicle. So there are other choices that would have included impounding it, which would have incurred a cost to the third party. We had satisfied ourselves evidentially. There were no other lines of inquiry in terms of the way, for example, asset seizure works, which I presume as well in terms of speculation about what we did or didn't do. So we have to work within the bounds of reasonableness. There was a social media frenzy on Sunday, but we thought best not to add to the speculation because there was no shortage of people sort of adding their insight. But I think, as you've heard from ACC Singleton today, there is probably a more pragmatic explanation of what has gone on, and we now have a line of inquiry we're pursuing. Clearly, given the uptake in the threat level, obviously not just in the field but at police stations, we want to have the confidence that our officers and staff are safe, and actually deter any sort of terrorist that is minded to launch an attack against the police, that we're doing all that is reasonable to protect buildings, vehicles and our people, and we will keep that under daily review.
Thank you, Chief. I have 2 more supplementals on this, Gerry, and then Nuala.
Thank you for the explanation. I just asked, was the vehicle taken and re-looked at for forensics? And I'll tell you why I'm asking the question. It strikes me that this was planned. It was planned to deal with the vehicle. The vehicle was there as evidence, and they came up and did it. So was it taken then again and looked at for evidence in case something was missed? And just secondary, were the people wearing balaclavas? Are they identifiable? I don't want you to tell me the ins and outs of your investigation, but just that.
Maybe just to pick up, if you don't mind, Gerry, just on a point from John. So, look, we accept the perception of how this has played out, and it's a massive frustration for us, because actually it takes away from what was really good work on the Friday evening whenever the 4 males were stopped and ultimately have been remanded in custody. We had completely finished with the BMW, and in fact the examination was more about making sure that there wasn't anything concealed in the car. I mean, these are 2 drug gangs that have been involved in this, so potentially drugs and or firearms were a concern. So our thinking around this is not that this was destruction of potentially missed evidence. We think this was an incident between the 2 gangs. There was a further subsequent investigation to support the arson investigation and inquiry that now has to be taken forward. And yes, I sort of hinted at it in my answer, but the station CCTV does provide a very strong line of inquiry, and I am optimistic that at least one of the 2 should be identifiable.
Thank you.
And Nuala?
Thank you, Chair. I just want to bring this back to the initial question from Mike. around the activities that have been happening in Ards North Down over the past 2 weeks. I understand that it was said that there was 13 arrests. I also understand as well that, Chief, you mentioned a feud amongst paramilitary groups, and it was also mentioned gangs, crime gangs, paramilitary feud, drug gangs, and different words that are thrown about there. But it's been clear in all the media that's been put out there, and by residents as well, that this is a paramilitary feud. So I do have a question: that how many have been charged with being members of a prescribed organisation, and will that actually be forthcoming in the next few weeks if it is known by the media, by the police, that this is a paramilitary feud? That will people be charged with being a member of a prescribed organisation?
So I think, you know, we get wrapped up in putting labels on these people, and they've been described in those terms. And yes, there is a paramilitary influence in this, but these are people who have fallen out with the paramilitary groups that they belong to. These are acting as drug gangs. In either case, our policing response is the same. It's about protecting the public and bringing these people to justice. But it does speak to the issues around getting people charged with membership, and those are difficult charges to get over the line, even in clear cases. So it wouldn't necessarily be relevant in this when what we have is two drug dealing gangs who are previously paramilitaries who've fallen out with each other and are causing serious harm within the community. So the response that Bobby has articulated around what has happened, I think, is the appropriate one. In terms of wider paramilitary activity, I can give you a couple of figures about the work of the Paramilitary Crime Task Force since the 1st of January this year. They have carried out 52 searches, 19 arrests, 17 charges and 14 reports. This is outside of the North Down Ards incident. 17 drug seizure incidents with combined estimated street value of 107,000. 4 firearms seized, 3 other weapons seized, 1 ammunition seizure and approximately 79,000 pounds worth of cash seized, and 6 referrals to outside agencies. That's by one team in terms of the Paramilitary Crime Task Force, along with all the other policing efforts that we make through district policing to counter paramilitary activity. So I think you can see from that we are determined to do our bit in diminishing these people's ability to control and cause harm in our communities. But in regard to this particular incident, we are treating them as two drug gangs, which is what they are.
Okay.
Chair, if I just come in briefly, thanks for that. And I do think that it is helpful that you outlined the statistics there in tackling paramilitary activity. And we do note the number of arrests over the past few months, especially following the shooting of John Caldwell into dissident Republican paramilitary organisations, and that is important. But it is also important to recognise that these simply aren't just drug gangs, and that they are paramilitaries who control communities too, and that make sure that that message out there is that it's not acceptable anywhere within our community in Northern Ireland. And I understand the threshold for charging and getting across prosecutions for being a member of a prescribed organisation is quite high, but it is important that the message is that paramilitary membership and activity is not acceptable, regardless if your outgoing is for drugs or other crime related. They're still members of paramilitary organisations, because it has been described by the police as a paramilitary feud on many occasions. But I do thank you for those statistics that you gave.
And I think, just to be absolutely clear in that, Chair, we've said many times here before, it doesn't matter if they're organised crime gangs, if they're other types of gangs or paramilitaries, we will do everything we can to bring them to justice and to free the communities from their grip.
Thank you, Mark. Our second question is from Trevor on policing of this coming weekend. Trevor.
Thank you, Chair. I suppose maybe first of all, I'd actually like to offer my support in terms of you, Chief, in terms of the adjustments you've had to make in terms of the officers and our wishes should be with all of the force at the minute. I mean, we're obviously hearing already the suggestions of the 12-hour shifts and what impact that has on officers who have already been stretched for a considerable period of time. And then that takes us into the weekend. And I mean, as Bobby has said in terms of his introduction to remarks, or maybe know yourself, you talked about 90 notified parades, you talked about football matches, and all manner of things you want to talk about, maybe other parades that weren't notified. I suppose for me, I want the reassurance that this is the early start to parades. This is probably the first of the parades for this year, but I'm looking for reassurance about the perceptions in the past about two-tier policing and how you police certain events. That there'll be a consistent approach by yourselves, and that we'll not be talking about this later this year to say, well, that's not how you police those parades. So what we're really looking for reassurance, the public's looking for reassurance that, first of all, people live within the law, and those who don't are all treated equally.
Thank you, Chair. Well, firstly, thanks for the support, and I think it's worth paying tribute to the flexibility and sheer determination of officers and staff. Mark and I were only talking the day before yesterday about detectives that haven't had a day off for 3 weeks, such as the pace that they're working with a variety of investigations. We rehearsed last month the sheer determination to catch the people that attempted to kill John Caldwell, and then equally for uniform operational colleagues. They've been asked to do a lot at short notice, which has an effect on work life and their sort of sheer resilience. This isn't a policing stance we can maintain forever, but is a reflection that we have to balance the shrinking resource base with the growing threat. And I've got duties to, as you know, under the Police Act, to discharge that to the best of our ability. So it's a balancing act. In terms of the sort of the banner of two-tier policing, I think a number of you will know the efforts, particularly that Bobby has been undertaking in recent months to reach out to communities across the country. There was a very, I think, constructive recent meeting that some of you were involved in from the PUL side of things. But absolutely, that whilst each event is sort of fact and location specific, we are determined that we use all our tactics in a fair and impartial way to either prevent a breach of the law, to assume that people will follow any determination for notified parades, but that we are swift in our response. Now, clearly, in terms of shaping expectations over the next few days, sometimes we're not able, for safety reasons, to intervene in the moment, but I'll let Bobby sort of flower a bit more detail on the scale of the planning that we've done to try and reduce the risk, but we have to accept that we've got to balance at times what we can do in the moment and what's more prudent to do safely with a follow-up arrest phase if people break the law. But we are here to do it sort of fairly right across the country, no matter what community you represent. Do you want to?
Yeah, and just by way of reassurance, so our initial strategy that sets out the kind of framework as to how we'll approach all events has actually been in place since before St. Patrick's Day, and that was actually the first deployment of it, if you like, in 2023. So that will govern the approach that we take to all events. As the Chief mentioned, though, it's vitally important at the same time that we make sure that we treat every set of circumstances in its own right, and we don't try and artificially apply a one-size-fits-all approach either. But it's having the framework consistent that's vitally important. And in terms of these events that are coming up this particular weekend, the Chief's touched on it. There are early indications, and Mark may want to say something about this as well. The Chief touched upon it in his opening address, early indications of unnotified parades, an appetite or an aspiration potentially to draw us into disorder. So we've been working very closely as a team. My team's under local policing with Mark's in crime in particular, to try and take all the preemptive opportunities that we can in order to offset the potential for those things happening in the first place. We will have an extensive evidence gathering operation in place all over the weekend, and we'll also be in a position to be able to respond as quickly as we can from a criminal justice perspective to make sure that we maximise the opportunities for success. So by way of reassurance, that plan has been going on now for some time. It will continue between now and the weekend, and we'll look to put ourselves in the best position to be able to provide an effective policing response.
If I just could come back, it's probably worth noting, and you referenced the work that Bobby's doing. I was at one of those events. It was very worthwhile. I think it's been important engagement, because engagement has been lacking in the past. I think it's a good first step in relation to that. However, I suppose all of these things, as the proof will be in the pudding and the eating of all of this. I think Bobby would have heard firsthand the frustrations of some of those people in the room that day. And I think some people may have heard it for the first time. So I think whilst that work has started, we don't want to undo that work very quickly either. But we do wish your officers well at the weekend because we understand the difficult challenge that it would have in some of those particular instances.
Okay, thank you, Trevor. Our question 3 is from Edgar on the impact of threat level and budget.
Thanks, Chair. In your opening remarks, you reflected the concerns of the board about the budgetary situation. And when the DCC commented on the implications of the change in the threat level from substantial to severe, he noted that these would include transferring resources from mainstream grant to additional security fund. What assessment have you made, Chief Constable, of the consequences of a reduction in the mainstream fund for normal policing services?
Thank you, Edgar. Excuse me. If I can, Chair, it's probably timely, given what's going on, to ask Pamela to give, as best we can, an assessment of what we found out last night, and then bring Mark in on some of the actual challenges of dealing with the severe threat at the moment.
Thanks, Edgar. Try and give you some context to this and keep the numbers as straightforward as I can. When we both engaged Resource Committee and the board, and indeed our event last week, you'd be familiar that we were saying that above our baseline budget, that we had a shortfall of over £100 million. So 107 million is the figure that we've referred to in the past. That's mainly built up from a recognition that there are costs that we're incurring in 22-23, primarily around pay, that has an increased cost going into next year that wouldn't have normally been in that baseline. That and really the increase in utility costs are the big elements of that £100 million. We've brought forward to you in the past that we could achieve a £50 million saving against that, where we had identified recurrent savings coming forward from last year. So that had been leaving us with this £57 million gap that you will be familiar with. We had engagement yesterday with the Department of Justice, and indeed got correspondence last night to say that there would be a further 4.75% indicative cut to our baseline. So for us, that means an additional £35 million on the figures that we had previously provided you with. So really we're saying it's more like 150 million. We've got plans for 50, but we don't have plans for the 100, as you can imagine. And £150 million out of our, £750 million baseline budget is a 20% impact cut to the funding that we require to continue services. And that is, I do reiterate, that is after having reduced the headcount last year and a plan to reduce the headcount further this year. So there is nowhere really else to go on the headcount side. And with a further £100 million of a gap, we just about spend that in our non-pay in a year. So with our mechanism to turn off some of those fixed costs aren't there to us. So it's extremely challenging. So we have recognised that in the wider financial envelope and the pressures that we face, that this is particularly in light of recent events where we have been looking at the threat level and the risks that we are now known to us sitting in that. And as the Chief Constable has said, our obligations and responsibilities within that as well. But I'll refer to Mark around some of the activities that we had envisaged over the incoming weeks. Was it this one? Sorry, I thought it was this one. Around just how we are really surging and moving people around the organisation over the incoming weeks, and the impact that will have on some of our services at the moment.
Thanks. So first of all, just to sort of tease out a bit, what does it mean that the threat level has risen to severe? Well, we've talked here about the fact that violent dissident Republican groupings, their intent and capability is higher, their tempo of attack planning is higher. The types of attacks we anticipate and assess that they are trying to carry out against our officers, primarily police officers on and off duty, but as I've said, also prison officers or military personnel. Those are attacks both with long and short barreled weapons, so similar to what we saw against John Caldwell, long arm attacks on police patrols. We expect that they are planning further attacks such as we saw in Strabane, with an improvised explosive device being fired at a police vehicle. And in addition to that, under vehicle IEDs at police officers' homes and elsewhere. And we assess they still plan to try and carry out attacks using vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, vehicle-borne bombs. And I think that shows their complete disregard if more proof were needed for the safety of the public in their intent to carry out attacks against police officers. In order to counter that, we have been working at a very high pace ourselves, and that puts a lot of pressure into the organisation. We are determined to continue to deliver community policing. In order to do that, all the structures that we have in every part of the organisation is flexed at mitigating and countering those who seek to attack us and cause harm, and to bring them to justice. And then when we talk about the pressures that Bobby and Chris are dealing with over the incoming weeks, and the operations we have to provide there, we have to flex our resources. So, for example, things like investigations into fraud, into economic crime, homicide investigations, certain elements of those will be slowed down, will be paused while we seek to direct our resources to the main weight of effort, which is to keep the public and safe, and our officers and staff safe as well.
Are there any provision for the exceptional items, for example, like the President's visit and the subsequent activity?
Yeah, it's an absolute. We once we've got the full costs when the operation is finished, we will assess that and see if it's possible to submit a bid to UK government for cost recovery, but it's not certain.
Okay, thank you. And a supplemental from Mark on this?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the team. It is really on the current threat and the response to it, and given the seriousness of the situation outlined by the PSNI there, it makes this question almost as difficult to ask as it will be to answer. Now, I'd say over 90% of people I speak with support the PSNI and stand with you at this time of increased danger and risk. And if we're to maximise the effectiveness of policing, we're going to have to maximise support for, or at least acceptance of, the PSNI to combat groups that try to control communities. But I mean, these so-called Republican groups will do all that they can to undermine the PSNI and their characterisation of the service as some imperial crown force cracking down or coming down hard on nationalists helps them to do so. So I think it's essential that any investigations and inquiries are, and are seen to be, carried out with proportionality and equity. As the Chief Constable assured that they are, that the approach to date has been equitable, proportionate and effective.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And I think it's important the point you make about the support from the public, and also appeal if people have information is to tell the local officer, ring 101 or use the Crime Stoppers hotline, because every little piece of insight that we get might be something that is the missing link to prevent another attack of the nature that John Corbould suffered. So I think certainly I can speak for example, between effectively Mark and Mark, we meet regularly to have a briefing on the wider security situation, the multiple threats we're facing. And I think I can assure you that every care is taken, for example, at time of day that searches take place, how the policing tone and style reflects that. There will obviously be, if you project forwards, sometimes you can't rule out the fact that if we've got an immediate threat to life, we have to react very quickly and balance a range of competing issues to do that. But certainly in terms of the thoroughness and professionalism, both of our own officers and staff, but also the support we get from other security partners, I think it's a thing that we can't always go into frustrating, I guess, the finite detail of X and Y because of the nature of what we're dealing with. But I can certainly say over my 4 years here, the care and thought that goes in, the sheer determination of officers and staff to catch the people, as you say, a relatively small number that are determined to cause us serious harm. But I don't know if you want to add anything else, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Chief, and thanks, Mark. I think potentially some of the intense work that we've been carrying out in Derry City in recent weeks may be what's in the back of your mind when you ask a question. Firstly, I'd like to thank the community for their patience and support in working with us. And we know how valuable that is, and also the support we've been given, particularly in the wake of the attack on John Caldwell. And we work very closely, as the Chief says, at a senior level, but also with Bobby's people on the ground, with Chris's people in TSG. We manage that. We carried out multiple searches last Saturday morning, and we had local police officers on the ground liaising with community and received very good community support for those searches to try and deal with the threat. I think there's also something in terms of an appeal, firstly, as the Chief says, for information. So anybody with any sort of information to come forward and let us know. They may not think it's relevant, but it might be. And also then, as we talk about in paramilitary space in dealing with any of these types of threats, it's incumbent on every part of society and the state, whether that be in the voluntary sector or in education and social care, to try and intervene early and help us pull people away from getting involved in these type of groups, and then for us as a police service to bring people to justice.
Thank you. Another question now from Peter on the budget impact on confidence in policing.
Thanks, Chair and Chief and the team. I think you've touched on aspects of this question as you've gone through what has been a very sobering introduction to the challenges that you face in coming weeks, and an even more sobering summary of the budgetary challenges which seem to have got worse overnight. Can I ask you, in that context, especially in the context of the pressures on the budget, what impact, if any, would they have on confidence in policing, especially at neighbourhood level, where the police deal directly with the public and issues that matter directly to them?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is probably something we touched a bit on last week at the away day that Chair referenced, Peter. I think this is probably one of the issues that we're going to have to keep returning to as the year goes on, because I suppose you get the science that sits behind how you measure public confidence. There are, for example, sort of stages of police service that the academic evidence would show affects people's support for the police. So the first one, for example, is ease of contact. So when you pick the phone up, which is still how most people want to get in touch with us, is it a prompt response on 999 and 101? And then it goes through the various stages of response, investigation, victim care, etc. So there are some things that, if you chose to, you could put a structure around. And I think if there's a plea here, you'll know as a board, we haven't had that granular information for a number of years now, because the countrywide survey that gave us that insight was cut by the Department of Justice. So we only rely now on small-scale surveys that either yourselves do or SNAP surveys, for example, in terms of victim care and follow-up, which actually has improved over recent months. So I think there's the sort of quantitative side of, can we put numbers on things? But also, as there's been a hint of a number of questions today, regardless of that, the emotional side. So inevitably, if people see less police, which is what we're starkly talking about, people may well start to change their feelings of safety in their local community. When the experience becomes that, we've talked a few times about our impressive record in 999 attendance, an average of 8 minutes. If that starts to deteriorate, people will start to literally feel that, because if any of you have ever been in that sort of nightmare situation, even a couple of minutes seems a long time. But you've got someone breaking into your home and it takes 20 minutes to get there, that's even more distressing. So we're going to have to do some quite careful balancing act. Indeed, only this afternoon after this meeting, Pamela, I and Aldrina, who's not here today, are sitting down to try and look and come back to you as soon as we can with some sense of what the shape of the new operating model for the organisation is. Because if you sit here today in early April, you can predict by the end of the year our shape is going to be different now, given the strain that's going into the organisation. So yes, we will still patrol. Yes, we will still pick the phone up. Yes, we will still turn up and investigate crime. But there are going to be key things we are going to have to get serious now in order to try and manage some of the competing pressures. And that inevitably will feel different for the public. And I know it's the sort of $64 million question that yourselves and many journalists keep coming back to, well, what will the list be? I think effectively we've got an assumption that many things will take longer. We're already in a criminal justice system where justice takes too long. You compare the sentencing the other day to the killer in Liverpool, which took about 7 months till the experience here. It just takes too long, and that again will just only, I guess, get worse as other resource in the criminal justice sector is cut. It's been well rehearsed by the IFS study recently about the disproportionate effect of cuts on justice, if you read that report. So there's a whole mix of stuff here I think we've got to come back to as soon as we can. And then I'm asking Mark to lead on some work to do sort of what, particularly with health partners, we're going to have to get serious and put them on notice about what we won't be doing pretty soon now, because although it won't close a budgetary gap, as Pam was saying only yesterday, inevitably as police officers, few of them are asking to do more police work, we're going to have to stop filling the void in other public sector gaps. And that'll be something that Mark will be dealing with us over the next few months.
Okay, thank you. Joanne, supplemental to this?
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Chief. You've touched on some of this anyway, but the picture that you had been giving us in the run up to this was stark, and now it just seems horrendous, and I feel for you and I don't envy your task. Could you give us some idea? You've kind of touched on it, but just if you could expand a bit, give us some idea of what a 20% cut looks like, and the extent to which you can in a public forum. Can you give us some indication of the factors you're looking at and how all of this might impact policing in the longer term, as well as provide some reassurance to the public who might, on hearing these messages, kind of suddenly think, okay, we're about to enter a criminal's paradise, but that's not your intention. So it would be helpful if you could outline some of those things. Thank you.
Well, I think the first question, without making it easy for anyone else, we want to assure the public our determination to keep criminals on the back foot. So if we're to do that, I mean, that's our core purpose. So even back to the earlier comments, we're going to have to get serious with other partners that know we're not turning up to that, because we need to catch crime in action. We need to investigate crime. We cannot continue to keep doing work on your behalf. I think in terms of, Pamela can sort of give you some sense of this, Joanne, but in relation to, I think the first thing, as things stand, obviously we take our responsibility seriously, but the key tension is the legal duties I have as Chief Constable, supported by the team, to carry out what's set out in the Police Act and other primary legislation, which means I've got a statutory responsibility that I must do these things. Not as a professional police officer, I want to countenance for one moment, stopping most of what is at play here. But equally, we've got to try the best we can under the accounting framework to balance a budget. But as we sit down this morning, if most of these costs are in fixed assets, we can't sell buildings quickly, even if we wanted to. We can't breach contracts, even if we wanted to. So our wriggle room against the impending costs is very, very limited. And so the even bigger question is almost, we'll come back to you and have dialogue, but what do we do next? We can't stop putting fuels in vehicles. We can't stop renewing sort of the fleet to keep us going operationally. But these are some of the dilemmas that Pamela's now wrestling with. But do you want to say anything else?
Come in a little bit, Joanne. There's two main aspects of what our funding goes to pay for. Our workforce, our officers and our staff, and then what we call non-pay. So with the exception of very small numbers, we are reducing the workforce. We came to you last year, officer headcount reduction by over 300, and a similar plan going into this year, albeit with a small element of recruitment, which we have spoken to you about. So that, in the main, when we talk about our impact on service delivery, it's from our people. Now, there's some of the non-pay elements which would have an impact on service delivery as well. But right across, officer and staff, and remember, a lot of the frontline staff are police staff, contact management centres, custody officers, and so on and so forth. So any hit into that staff, but we are close to maxing that out. So by the end of this year, it'll be circa 600-700 officers and a couple of hundred staff less. That is your main impact on service delivery. So when you ask the questions of what will look different, what will feel different, in the main, that's from your people delivery, because we are a people-based service. Our challenge, and that in the main, going into next year, Joanne, saves us circa 30 million. So part of our £50 million savings that we're saying we can do, 30 of that comes from our headcount. So if we're looking at 150 less 30, then you ask, well, where's the 120 million that's being asked of us coming from, on the basis that we spend 140 in total? And the Chief has touched on it. Approximately 80 to 90% of our costs are fixed. So we're into long-term contractual budgets around a lot of our software. I don't think I'm going to have the opportunity to approach our local government colleagues and say I'm not paying the rates as we go into next year. We have forensic science service level agreement that we have. Things like that, we don't certainly in year have any mechanism of reversing or changing. So those are our fixed costs. And then we look at things that are what we call operationally essential. And again, the chief has touched on them. Fuel has to go in the cars to be able to get our officers to be able to respond to the calls. And ammunition purchases like that we just need to do. So we will look at them and we will schedule them. But by way of our ability to bring you back a piece of paper that says that we can balance the budget in 23-24, I think I need to be honest and say that is not doable. And it's not for the want of trying or not being difficult, but there is no mechanism to really achieve that, certainly in a single in-year budget. I'm not even sure if you give me 3 years to do it, I would be able to do it, but it's certainly not achievable in year.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you. And Linda.
Thank you. Just on the back of what Bobby Singleton outlined around the real reliance that we had on neighbourhood teams around the issues that happened in Ards North Down, can we get a reassurance that neighbourhood teams will still be prioritised, that the importance of them will still be at the top of the pile and that they don't reduce in the level of kind of priority that they've been given to date because of this new budget? And that's not to say I understand savings have to be made, but I still would like to have that reassurance around the neighbourhood teams, because it is important not only in confidence but also, as has been outlined, in terms of actually delivery on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it goes back again to some of the constructive conversations I think we had last week, Linda, that in a nice way, even to start with myself, I've hung my hat on this label for 4 years, that, you know, many times I've talked about the importance for me personally and professionally around neighbourhood policing, and, you know, go back to Mark's early work in another role, how we saw numbers grow. We've had feedback from every community, every person in this room, I think, about the appreciation for what neighbourhood officers are able to achieve in places that maybe even a few years ago you wouldn't have expected to see us. And that's not to create, a bit like Trevor's two-tier policing question, we don't want a tiered workforce where we're giving a message that we value person A more than B, because we're a whole organisation endeavour. I think the only assurance I can give at the moment is that it still remains a priority to make sure that in some form that every community in Northern Ireland receives neighbourhood policing. But I've asked for some options from Bobby about what that might look like, because what they do may change. So we may still have people there but doing different things. You will still see them as a team. And Pamela and I and others have got to look at if there is less feed coming in from recruitment, because effectively our response teams and our neighbourhood teams, in the nicest way, are the sort of sump that specialists recruit from. Well, if there's nothing coming in at the front, and we still have critical roles we have to fulfil, for example, specialist firearms teams, which, you know, is important in the threat that we face at the moment, specialist surveillance teams, specialist search teams, there's going to be an ever-growing tension of how long can you hold that commitment unequivocally that we won't see it change dramatically. So they are questions that, as I said earlier, we'll be actually starting to raise in detail this afternoon, or we've had some planning for a while. And certainly Bobby will be coming back with his options about what could it look like. And I guess either through committee or bilaterals, as we're doing that over the next few weeks and months, is about conversations so there's no surprises. But we have to be candid that we are under extreme pressure now to keep all the commitments that we've given in the way you've been used to, because it's just becoming increasingly difficult.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Linda. We're going to move on to another question from Frank on processing of misconduct cases.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Simon and team. The media are reporting a diverse range and type of misconduct cases involving serving officers that in some cases are taking an extremely long time to process. Can you share with us the number of cases that are currently being progressed or in the process, cases by type, and can you assure the board and our public that all such instances of misconduct are now going forward going to be dealt with in a timely fashion?
Yeah, thanks. Sean. I'll bring Mark in if I can, the right Mark this time, because I know of the work that he's been doing. I'm going to remind you of the verbal feedback we've had from HMIC about the impressive efforts we've made in the last 12, 18 months to really focus and draw down all of our expertise in relation to tackling sort of misconduct across the range. And just a small sort of throwaway fact, I myself have sat on 13 special case hearings in the last 12 months. So that's what one track we can use when a criteria is met to, subject to appropriate checks and balances, exit officers from the organisation that we don't think have a place anymore. But Mark can give you some specifics on sort of what we're doing, volume and timeliness, etc.
Sure. But before I do, Frank, I think it's probably fair to say that every comment you've had about the resource availability to the PSNI is as applicable to this area of investigation as anywhere else. So, I've got 161 gross misconduct cases running, which shows the level of input and the level of rigour and vigour that we are bringing to every allegation that's raised, whether those allegations are proven or not proven, whether they end up in court, as you've seen some in court this week, or whether they end up in misconduct or not. So, and there's a range of outcomes, Frank, that we can get to, from not proven, no further action, to right through to conviction, and in some cases to imprisonment, all sorts of things. And there are multiple stages to that investigative process, from early assessment right through to full serious crime investigations. So we're running 161 cases at the minute. We have put extra resources into BSD over the last 6 months, but I can't give you a guarantee that BSD is the only priority facing the Chief Constable, given the briefings that you've had today and the availability of resources and the availability of detectives. But I can give you a guarantee that we're not going to ease off the pedal in dealing with the issues. But that means that I can't say unequivocally that every case won't incur delay. We're going to have to see the cases through. There is a finite number of people working on them. Last year, I think we dismissed 22 people in a 12-month period. So that sort of shows you the level of speed at which we're moving through cases. In February alone, we closed 20 misconduct files. That ranged from data protection, failure to investigate, breach of COVID regulations, inappropriate comments, harassment, inappropriate social media activity, sending sexually explicit messages, and the list goes on. So it's 1 month, 20 cases closed. So we provided you with a report as well, with extra detail on by rank and so forth. So the work is going on. We are also continuing to carry out our review of historic cases. We are picking up all the recommendations that are falling out of applicable matters in London and other parts of the jurisdiction. And we've made a lot of progress. But I just want to be careful around giving you a guarantee that these cases will necessarily speed up more than they are at the minute, because actually the headcount's dropping. And it applies here as well. But we are considerably quicker than we were. There's a few cases that are very old, and I'm very concerned about those. They are generally slowed down as well because of COVID created an issue for us all. There's also delays in the justice system. There's pressures on the PPS, with whom we're putting pressure on them to move our files, and there's pressure in the court system as well. So the most serious cases can take quite a long time, and that you'll see that in cases that don't involve police officers as well. But I would ask the board to consider this issue of delay and process in the round with all the issues that the Chief Constable has announced today about pressure on the service.
Okay, thank you, Mark and Frank. Thank you. We're moving on from a question from Mark on unexplained wealth orders.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, the National Crime Agency in hard cash terms spend around 1% of their budget. Here, we're 3% of the population. The head of the NCA advised the board earlier this year that there has been just one Northern Ireland application for an unexplained wealth order. That's something that was heralded as a game changer, if I recall, but now is being described as niche. The Independent Reporting Commission says we need our own civil recovery organisation. How would you view each of these issues, Chief Constable? That's the NCA spend, applications to seize assets, and a Northern Ireland Assets Agency.
If I take the last first, well, I've said more than once personally, if our environment was different, I would welcome the sort of service, for example, you see with our colleagues in Garda Síochána, where they have a defined asset recovery approach, which is seen as very successful. And there are numbers of strands in which we can seize cash and other assets through, I think it's a funny acronym, isn't it, the POCA arrangements. Unexplained wealth orders, I think you're right, that I wouldn't want to sort of undermine what people have said in the past, but the experience is the threshold is high, and it's only an order that the MTA can take out on our behalf. So it is but one of a number of tools, and only yesterday, Mark and I, and the head of the fight against organised crime, were looking at the range of things we're doing, which we can probably speak about more in private session, to give you some confidence that every civil power or criminal power that's at our disposal, we're trying to deploy against organised crime groups. So that I think there's an intent here to keep pressure on those that want to peddle drugs, traffic people, and so on and so forth. So that range is there. To reassure you as well, I've had a number of conversations with the head of the NCA myself, as well as Mark has been in active dialogue with the regional lead to make sure that the investment that we are making in them, we're getting a return on that investment that continues to keep the pressure on the organised criminals that potentially can do the most harm in communities. But we can probably explore it in a bit more depth in the next session, but unless you want to say anything else at the moment, Mark.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And a supplement on this from Nuala?
Chair, I think it's best maybe for the private session.
That's fine, thank you very much. And the last question for this session is from Les on crime reporting.
Thank you, Chair. Chief Constable, in the midst of the maelstrom that you're facing, I have another aspect of policing I want to ask about. And that is that following the recent reports from representative organisations that have observed that some people from Black and minority ethnic communities who are victims or witnesses of crime are reluctant to come forward due to the fear of being reported to the Home Office. Can you say what action PSNI is considering to overcome this issue?
Yes, thanks, Led. Firstly, we appreciate this is a really sensitive issue, which we've discussed a number of times, I think, here and in committee and in the margins, so that it's balancing a range of issues. But we have the whole matter under review now, which I think Bobby can pick up on some of the work that we're doing to try and get that balance right, that we're here to support victims who may have been trafficked, for example, and suffered horrendous experiences of, for example, sexual crime. Pamela and I think, had probably one of the most memorable meetings of our last 12 months was at Women's Aid in Belfast, hearing about experiences firsthand of women that have been trafficked from the Middle East to here, and it was absolutely horrendous. So we want to make sure that they're absolute to protect and support people in that situation. But Bobby can give you some sort of broader detail of where we're at with this difficult issue.
Yeah, thanks, Chief. So we can confirm that we have already commenced a comprehensive internal review of our current policy position and our end-to-end processes for engaging with victims and witnesses who may have insecure immigration status. In order to ensure that any revised policy position is fully informed, we'll also be engaging with our partner, the Home Office, but importantly, a range of external stakeholders, including board members, the board's human rights legal advisor, and those who have previously raised the matter with us, and indeed members of the board. We'll be doing that through a series of individual meetings, but we also plan to hold a future reference engagement and listening event specifically on this area in order to properly inform the development of our policy. And I'd hope to come back to the board in a few months' time with an updated position on that.
Thanks, that's very welcome. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Les, and that's the end of the questions here. Chief Constable, thanks to you and your team for taking the questions, and to all of us who have joined us online. It is very clear that you, as a senior team, are dealing with a very challenging time ahead and very difficult circumstances. And the next few weeks will be very, very difficult. So can I thank you for your team for the support that you're going to give us all and what you're doing presently. And can I place on record our thanks to all the officers, from Constable to Chief Superintendent, who are not in this room, and for all the work they're going to be doing in the next few weeks. I can't underestimate how much we appreciate that. Thank you very much. We are, as a board, currently progressing and Community Policing Survey 2023, so we're very keen to get views in and around this. We've made it very easy for you all to complete, so just scan and complete, and the details are available on our website and social media feeds. Thank you very much, and that concludes today's session.